Otherwise I can forget them. Alright.
Good evening. Hello, good evening everyone. Thank you. We'll start now. Good evening and a very warm welcome to University College London. Thank you all for coming to our first joint event with the Lancet Psychiatry and the Mental Health. This evening we're going to be discussing and debating preventable harm, real risk assessment, the evidence base. And as this event is also being broadcast on the net, I'd like to also say a very special welcome to everyone who's watching. And if you are watching, you can join us using the hashtag preventable harm. I'm Dr. Michael Bloomfield. I'm going to be one of your chairs today. I'm a clinical lecturer in psychiatry here at University College London. And I'd also like to introduce our panel. With me and my co-chair is Professor Alan Simpson, who's Professor of Collaborative Mental Health Nursing and leads the Centre for Mental Health Research at City University London, and also works closely with East London NHS Foundation Trust. And going along the panel, we have Dr. Farhana Mann, who's a clinical training fellow here at University College London and also a specialty registrar in general psychiatry and working locally here in Camden and Islington. And her research interest is in loneliness and social isolation. And she's also, we're very pleased to say, recently been awarded a Wellcome Trust Research Fellowship. Dr. Sarah Carr is Associate Professor of Mental Health Research at Middlesex University London and Vice Chair of the National Survivor User Network. And her work's informed by lived experience of mental distress and service use. Dr. Alice Cole-King works at the Betsy Cadwallader Health Board as a liaison psychiatrist and is a clinical director of Connecting People, a not-for-profit social enterprise. Professor Sina Fazell is Professor of Forensic Psychiatry at the University of Oxford and Wellcome Trust Senior Researcher, and his clinical work is as a visiting psychiatrist at a local prison. And Dr. Hind Khalifa is a consultant psychiatrist in perinatal mental health at South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, having completed a Medical Research Council PhD on violence against people with serious mental illnesses here at UCL. And we also have Dr. Niall Boyce, who's going to be in the audience, who worked for several years as a trainee in psychiatry here in London before joining the Lancet as a senior editor in 2010, and he founded and launched the Lancet Psychiatry in 2014. We're also joined in the audience by Andrew Tomlin from the Mental Health, so please join me in welcoming the panel. This evening we're going to be hearing first from each of our panellists, and they'll be allowed to speak for 5 minutes. And we're going to, it's very important that we stick to time so that we can enjoy the debate as much as possible. So your chairs will give you a very polite, gentle nudge when we've got 1 minute left. We won't take any questions until all the speakers have finished. And so without further ado, I'll hand the microphone over to Dr. Farhana Mann.
Yeah. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. I've been a trainee for a while now, and a colleague said to me the other day, "Aren't you a consultant yet? You always seem to be a few months away, and then you find a new tactic to delay it. Whether it's having kids, or going part-time, or more recently spending time in research. Now, I insist on not delaying anything. It just happens to be a really great time in the NHS to be a junior doctor. I think we all agree. What's not to love? Anyway, in all seriousness, it has got me thinking. Is this really it? Where are all those answers I thought I'd have for sure at the end of all this training? Where's the absolute certainty I'd hoped I could hold as the man in charge to end? I need more data. Do I need more data? And what data is that? At 3 a.m, I find myself faced with a young woman who's had thoughts of hurting herself, but very much regrets it and wants to go home. She's not from our area, she has kids at home, and her partner is insisting she doesn't need to talk to me. The A&E nurse, they're not all like this, says she's spoilt and she's pushing for discharge. I must speak with that member of staff later. Meanwhile, someone on the ward is hearing voices, and the junior nurse is worried about him going out on leave as he has a history of violence. What should we do, doctor? And a new, well-known patient has been brought in by the police. He looks a bit off colour, and they say, oh, he's probably just drunk. It's a lot, and there's judgment involved. Will she? Won't she? Why is the partner so insistent? Who do I see first? The reality is each of these people needs and deserves a full, thorough assessment. Each of them has their own set of psychological, physical, and social circumstances, and my decisions, typically discussed in a team if I can, could have very serious consequences. What needs to drive decisions around admitting to hospital, whether we call children's services, requesting health act assessment or demanding a brain scan is clinical judgment. And whenever possible, shared decision-making, shared with service users and other staff, not just clinical judgment, I'll add. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who needs to document the decision and be able to justify it, weighing up capacity, autonomy, sanity, responsibility, etc. I rely on my skills as a communicator, trying to get a real sense of what it is that's happening in this individual's life, as real a sense of that as possible. We gather whatever relevant information we can from records, the police, or any family, and at 3 a.m. that isn't always very much. And I weigh that up in the context of what we know from epidemiological studies. But data is, of course, not enough. There is this need for a combination of using data and using one's own clinical judgment. We simply don't have enough data to cover risk across all groups in all circumstances in society. And even if we miraculously did one day far in the future, there will always be exceptions to the rule. And what holds true for the average female or person with depression isn't necessarily the case for the person sitting in front of me. The NICE guidelines on self-harm promote the use of risk assessments, but also promote being sensible. So it's not about blindly following an algorithm and moving on to the next case. It's obviously about connecting with that individual as best as you can, while holding the algorithm and the data in mind, and not ignoring your own instincts as an experienced clinician and fellow human being if someone's in distress. Sometimes that means making decisions that not everyone agrees with, and at some point, I worry about it, but I may get it wrong. Is there any amount of data that will totally remove that possibility? Probably not. But perhaps that complexity is something we need to work harder to communicate to the wider public. And whilst, of course, there may be devastating outcomes for service users and their families in situations where things go wrong, and patients are always the priority, I just wanted to mention that it's worth noting suicide rates for doctors under investigation are 13 times higher than the general public. Doctors, for the most part, are trying desperately to get it right. Wider society can be frighteningly quick to blame individuals who may have made the best decision they could have at that time. That's not an excuse, we all have to be held accountable, but expectations of professionals when predicting risk have to be realistic. Epidemiological evidence is vital and informative, but of course it is limited in its scope. It can never be everything. And I would like to see more of a push for more qualitative work, or mixed methods work, exploring individual circumstances and people with lived experience, for example, as well as more consideration of social relationships, partly because I'm very interested in loneliness, which happens to be associated with a significantly increased risk of suicide and self-harm. Also, there's a reasonable body of evidence on what we ask people when assessing risks, but not necessarily how we go about doing that, how we go about having these conversations in the most meaningful, helpful way. And as a clinician, I'm very encouraged that people, like for example Rose McCabe, I think is doing work on that, and obviously lots of members of this panel are addressing various aspects of this and studying what helps reduce risk over time. So in summary, I believe we try to use epidemiological evidence to inform our assessments day to day, but working on the shop floor involves individuals. each with their own journeys up to that point. Judging risk is a complex and evolving process, but a good place to start is being kind, compassionate, and non-judgmental. Handling that conversation well at 3 a.m. could be the difference between life and death.
I completely agree with the last sentence, by the way. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. The first is from a paper from the research that prompted this debate, by Alan and colleagues, and the paper's called Ordinary Risks and Accepted Fictions, by contrasting and competing priorities work in risk assessment and mental health care planning. And the second is from, I think, the most recent edition of the British Journal of Psychiatry. Firstly, in their study, Alan and his colleagues observed that care plan reviews found limited involvement of service users and family in risk assessment and management procedures. Workers locate risk as coming from the service user, are risk averse, and appear to prioritise the procedural aspects of assessment over direct involvement in risk management. I think it'd be useful to think about this finding, the locus of risk and harm remains with the individual, in the context of what was recently said about social psychiatry in this month's British Journal of Psychiatry. And I quote, "Interventions should be considered in a framework of social context where patients live and factors they face on a daily basis." And those psychiatrists talking about. I'd argue that risk assessment, as currently conceived and administered, was based on some sort of evidence once, but it was situated very much in the medical one. And that's now becoming outmoded and is increasingly becoming surpassed by other types of evidence and developments and reforms in mental health services, such as recovery and personalisation, and including mounting experiential evidence and investigations by and with service users and survivors, such as Alan's study. If we're discussing preventable harm, then we need to look at risk and harm which is not located with the individual, but located in the context and situations the individual is in. We need to ask some critical questions. Whose risk are we talking about here? Whose risk are we assessing? I'd like to sort of offer some of my own experiential evidence, just myself as a case study, on how risk assessment didn't make any sense to me. It didn't seem to be very evidence-based, even to the extent of regarding my individual history. And I saw that there were some complaints on Twitter that there were no pure experts by experience on this panel, but I hope my offering as a part-time academic, who's also a service user and survivor, suffices and doesn't bias my experiential evidence. Well, last year, my GP referred me back to my local community mental health team as my mental health was deteriorating, and I told her I was having persistent intrusive thoughts of suicide and self-harm. Warning signs. Seeing my notes, she knew I had a history of self-harm and suicidal behaviour, so she passed me on up. In old-fashioned psychiatric terms, I'm a risk, right? Well, not in terms of what seemed to matter to policymakers, anxious about stopping mad people from drinking too much booze. When I turned up for my assessment about the team, the only thing that really seemed to matter was my alcohol intake. Having no history of alcohol problems, I found this very strange and somewhat disconcerting. My risk assessment didn't seem to be evidence-based, even in terms of my own history. You could argue that I may have been left at risk as a result of that. So whose risk was being assessed and managed here? Was it my risk to myself or my risk to public health targets? Research I did on personal budgets also reflects some of my own experience, as it showed that in mental health and in social care as well, defensive risk management strategies or risk-averse frontline practice may result in individuals not being adequately supported to make choices and take control, and therefore being put at risk. Here, in many cases, the organisation or individual practitioners were being themselves protected from a perceived risk, and the individual was being put at risk as a consequence. We know from research reviews commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that service users and carer perspectives rarely feature in studies on risk assessment and management, nor are they regularly fully involved in the risk assessments and planning themselves. User-led research by the National Survivor User Network on the care programme approach suggested it's often experienced as an administrative process with little room for people to discuss risk in terms of positive risk-taking, as well as what they feel they need to stay safe. Other user-led research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation by Alison Faulkner in 2012 mentions the F word in relation to risk assessment. And the F word in this case is fear. And she said that disabled people and service users identified some additional and different risks to those commonly identified by professionals and policymakers. Fear featured powerfully in these conversations. A significant fear for many people, particularly at this time of welfare reform and service cuts, reviews and reassessments, was the fear of losing their independence. So it seems that an entirely new evidence base is emerging that underpins how risk and harm should be conceived by mental health services and more broadly, which demands a fundamental change in how risk assessments are carried out. Can we talk about fear? Can we talk about risk of harm from others? Can we talk about harm caused by welfare reform, housing and inequality? Because no matter how you choose to frame or describe mental distress, fear and exposure to harm will probably make things worse. Perhaps the most uncomfortable area is the risk of harm posed to people in mental distress by mental health services themselves, or the lack of them. And it's here that it seems that the psychiatric concept of risk begins to defy its own logic. People in great distress and who are unable to access support themselves or through their carers are taking their own or others' lives. Or they are forcibly detained in police custody, particularly if they're black, or prison, and sometimes they die there. I'd name Sarah Reid here. Are incidents that would once have been regarded as needing a public inquiry now just regarded as casual hazards? So how about a person-centred environmental harm assessment for those being detained in a psychiatric ward that takes into account the evidence about their race, history of trauma, age, gender identity or sexual orientation? And on the basis of that assessment, is hospital really a safe place for them to be at that time? This would make a good study. There's even a robust measure of acute inpatient experience called Voice that's being developed for service users and survivors that could be used. So research and recent reports are showing that acute services are becoming less therapeutic and more unsafe for many reasons, if they're available at all. Only last week, service user activist Alison Cameron tweeted from a psychiatric ward that she'd been detained in London that she'd witnessed a pregnant woman being pinned to the floor, which was subsequently reported in the media at the weekend. She asked if this was acceptable culture. It certainly isn't evidence-based. So I think for research we need to ask new questions about risk and harm, about fear, risk and harm based on a social model, and on the experiences of those who go through the system, because some of them don't come out again.
But I'd actually like to start by saying that I have difficulty with the term suicide risk assessment, because actually a far better term is assessment of someone at risk of suicide. And by calling it a suicide risk assessment, it appears that the assessment of risk is more important than actually that person's deep distress and how we can engage with them and help them so that actually they no longer want to end their life, that actually that we can work with them collaboratively so that suicide for them is no longer an option. I also think that sometimes services can appear to be, and I can see why they can appear to be by people who are being treated with them, that they're focused on quantifying and characterising the risk. That once we've done our risk assessment, we've looked at the risk, we've named it, we've measured it, we can now move on. And actually we don't think, what can I do to help this person not want to end their life today? What can I do to help this person not want to end their life this week, this month? We do know that certain factors in people's experience, in their background, in their current emotional world, in their psychological world, do increase their risk of suicide. However, we do patients and we do ourselves a grave disservice if we focus on trying to predict the minutiae of which exact risk factor will exactly be responsible for their suicide. It's flawed from the very beginning. For a start, the majority of people who die by suicide were not even seen by specialist mental health services in the year before they died. Those people who had been seen were judged as low or absent risk by their team, and they had died by suicide often within a week of that last encounter. So it's fundamentally flawed the way we're actually approaching it from the beginning. And I think that's partly because we're not actually looking at the unconscious factors. And I'm really glad the other two mentioned the things about the fear and the stigma. Assessing someone's wish to live or die, we are so much dependent on what that person chooses to share with us or chooses not to share with us. And I don't think we talk enough and we don't give enough credit to the compassion, the therapeutic relationship, and actually will that person who's seriously thinking of ending their life trust us enough to share with us maybe very frightening or embarrassing or shameful thoughts, because sometimes that's how services can make people feel. So we need to get the basics right. And it's almost like a part of medicine and healthcare and a part of society where we don't just need compassion, we also need the skills and the knowledge and the expertise. Because unless you understand the risk factor research, and there's a whole host of research, and it is as important as the compassion, because otherwise we might miss those cases which would be so easy to help if we just asked them. So we need to get the basics right, we need to totally change our language, we need a paradigm shift that instead of being obsessed by quantifying, characterising and managing risk, that we think, how can we mitigate it? How can we engage with this person so that actually they no longer want to end their life? I think that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Hello. So we've heard a little bit about risk to self. I'm going to mainly focus about risk to others. Just before I start, I'll just talk about the wider context, and then I'll talk something about the evidence and how we can improve it. Just the wider context, a couple of things really. One is that violence is going down everywhere, at least where people have measured it, for the last 2 or 3 decades, or at least 2 decades, that seems to be the case. But there are 2 groups where it hasn't been going down. One is people leaving prison, which every year, there's worldwide, the churn rate in prison is about 30 million, so there's quite a lot of people that involves. The other group where the rates of violence haven't been going down, where people look quite closely on people leaving psychiatric hospitals, so specifically people with severe mental illness. So the benefits that the wider society has achieved through people aren't entirely sure what those benefits are. They haven't seemed to have translated into these 2 high-risk populations. Second thing is those 2 high-risk, those 2 populations have relatively high absolute rates. So if you look at 2-year reoffending rates, it's 55 to 60% imprisonment, so that's quite a high absolute rate. If you look at people after they're diagnosed with schizophrenia, 5 years, if you follow them up, about 7-8% of people are convicted of a violent crime. Lifetime crime rates in people with schizophrenia, about a quarter if you use population registers in Scandinavian countries. So these absolute rates are quite high. And the relative risk is increased. People have done studies using sibling control, so that's quite a robust way of looking at relative risks. And people with severe mental illnesses do have increased relative risks. And finally, the wider context is that people sometimes come back and say, well, this might increase stigma. I think inattention to these things also increases stigma. So it has to be thought in the wider context, I think. So now something about scientific evidence. So I'm going to focus on violence. There's over 300 tools. There's a structured tools, so they have a list of risk factors, and you can score them in different ways, and they can be used in different ways. They give you probability scores, or they give you a high, low, medium risk rating. It's a bit, the scientific evidence really is a bit of a mixed bag. There's financial, non-financial conflict of interests, publication bias. When people look at what high means, it actually means quite different things to different people. They're costly and time-consuming. They distract, possibly, clinical teams from focusing on treating people, and that's one of the comments made before. And perhaps we're just better off improving all services rather than just focusing on those at high risk. I mean, that's the case for the prosecution. The case for the defence, though, is that actually, if you look at their performance on a range of measures, they do okay. So if you look at things like area under curve or sensitivity, specificity, and these various measures people use to test performance, they do well. I mean, they do relatively well compared to the rest of medicine. So if you look at prognostic tools in heart disease, for instance, they're similar. So the Framingham score or the Q-risk or a sign score, I mean, they're similar. The other things for the defence is that, they're transparent methods, they're reliable, so two people in different places might come up with similar scores. And they seem to be better than unstructured methods. They act as a bit of an aide-memoire for those clinicians that might need it. And they identify high-risk groups that can be targeted for higher intensities, needs assessments or further treatment. So I think there are some cases, there is some a good case for the defence there as well. What do I think the current state of play as well? I think personally, my own view is that they're useful adjuncts. They help anchor clinical judgment to some form of evidence, other forms of evidence. Depends on what they're used for ultimately. If they're used to screen out people, they do quite well. The negative predictive values are around 90%. If they're used to target people with non-harmful interventions, they do. I mean, I think that's a very useful way that they can be used because of the combination of high sensitivity and low PPVs, low positive predictive values. That could be one way of taking it forward. So non-harmful interventions, for instance, in people who leave prison with mental health problems, could be community linkage, could be just making much more of an effort to get them linked into their GPs and community mental health services drug lab. To improve the situation, well, I mean, this is an area of my I've been focusing on for a few years. I think you need large representative samples, you need hard outcomes, you need to pre-specify your protocols, you need to have external validations of anything that you develop as a risk assessment. Ideally, you have interview-independent measures because they're much more scalable, less likely to be biased. And you really want to come up with tools that have good measures of both discrimination and calibration, that are free to use, relatively simple, scalable, maybe give you a probability score and a categorical score of high, low, medium, depending on your own preferences. And that's one of the things we've tried to do with prisoners. We published a paper in Lancet Psychiatry a couple of months ago where we did this for a population of prisoners, I think for the first time. And the key thing there is, we pre-specified everything beforehand. So the cut-offs and the risk factors were all pre-specified, so we couldn't sort of soup it up. And that means that it's likely to be a little bit more transportable than other tools, which tend to sort of shrink when used in new populations. So, I mean, I think there are ways to improve these tools. The rest of medicine has done it for many years, particularly cardiovascular medicine. I think we can learn those lessons in psychiatry and push the field onwards from there.
So we've heard a little bit about risk to self and risk to others, and I wanted to focus on risk from others and preventable harm from others. And I think this is something that's been relatively neglected, both in clinical practice and in research. But fortunately, over the last couple of decades, we've got increasing research that can inform our practice. And I thought I'd just highlight 3 evidence-based areas where we can learn something from the victimization science and evidence base on how we can handle this issue in clinical practice. So the first is the issue of how common it is. So how common it is to be a victim of physical or sexual assault amongst people who use mental health services. And a recent systematic review that we've done shows that internationally, around 1 in 5 people who use mental health services, men or women, have been a victim of violence, physical violence, in the preceding year. And around 1 in 10 women who use mental health services have been a victim of sexual assault in the preceding year. And for lifetime figures, it has been as high, reported to be as high as 40%. So 4 out of 10 women have experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. So very high figures, and in general, compared to figures of people perpetrating violence against others, the proportion of people being a victim is higher than the proportion of people who are perpetrators. And whenever it's been, I think context is important in the general population. And again, victimization prevalence is going down in the general population, but it's staying, not changing much in people who use mental health services. And the risk is about 3 to 6 times higher in our population than in the general population. The second thing is the risk profile or risk factors. And again, a systematic review of risk factors suggests that being a victim of violence is not associated with age, with gender, with diagnosis, with socioeconomic status. And interestingly, this is very different from the picture in the general population. So in the general population, it's mainly young men who are likely to be a victim of physical assaults. But in our patient population, men and women are at equally high risk. And that's important in terms of interventions, because whereas interventions in the general population have been directed at young men, if we're thinking about interventions within mental health care settings, we need to focus on both men and women. Similarly, in the general population, women are at much higher risk of being a victim of sexual assault. And in people who use mental health services, women are still more likely than men, but actually men have quite high absolute prevalence. And a recent study we did in London showed that the proportion of men who had experienced lifetime adulthood sexual assault was similar to the proportion of women in the general population who had experienced adulthood sexual assault. So again, a real need there for detection, for interventions. So the third area where I think evidence is helpful is around detection and some qualitative evidence around not just what the evidence tells us, but how people want to be asked and in what way we can ask people so they can trust us enough to tell us what's happening. So the evidence suggests we only pick up about a third of cases where people have been a victim of recent violence, and that service users want to be asked as long as they're asked in the right way, as long as they're asked sensitively, as long as their wishes for interventions are taken into account. And interviews with professionals indicate that there are many barriers for them routinely inquiring, particularly about domestic violence or sexual violence, which are very prevalent, and we know some of the barriers for that. So finally, so what next and where do we go from here? I think there's been quite a lot of epidemiological research on the extent of the problem, the risk factors, the nature of violence that people experience, and I think it is time to move to intervention research and only maybe do observational research insofar as it would inform intervention research. And perhaps the place to start is not reinventing the wheel, but saying what interventions have worked in other populations, in primary care, in the general population, and what does the epidemiological evidence tell us about the ways in which we need to modify those interventions for our patient population within for mental health service users. So I think that would be the way forward in terms of reducing risk of harm from others.
We've already got some questions coming over on Twitter. I'm sure you have some questions too. I'm just going to hand over to my co-chair to reflect on some of the issues that we've heard. We'll start the discussion here in the panel and then we'll open it up.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. I'm only going to say a couple of minutes things because I'm sure lots of people have lots of questions and thoughts, and I think that's more important. First of all, apologies for the chilliness in the room. We'll see if we can get the heat turned up. It was quite interesting in the lead up to this. There was some discussion on Twitter, and as Sarah touched on, there was a perception that the service user voice wasn't represented on the panel. Incorrectly, but the perception was there. And there was a criticism of that. Similarly, I've been contacted by carers saying, what about carers? Don't forget, carers need to be involved in this too. And I think what's important about all that, and Sarah certainly touched on this, is that is very much the perception is that risk and safety is something that the professionals do. We sit in rooms and talk about it. We develop these multitude of measures and tools. But the people that this really matters to, that massively affects more than anybody else, frequently feel on the outside of this, not involved. For us, a quite surprising finding, actually, a strong finding in our study across 6 different mental health service organisations in Wales and England, our COCAP study, was that every single manager and clinician that we interviewed, when we asked them about care planning, said risk was the number one thing, that was the driver, that was foremost. And yet, when we interviewed service users and carers, many of them, the majority of them, said, don't really think they think about my safety very much. It wasn't something they felt was being considered. Carers say, no, I don't think they consider this. And that's quite astonishing, because it's absolutely foremost for everyone we spoke to. So there's a mismatch there going on. Something else that got mentioned was we absolutely need evidence. We absolutely need, as practitioners, to be aware of evidence and draw that into our practice. But this issue of the therapeutic relationship, massively important. The ability for compassion, the ability to really listen and engage with people, massively important. But again, from our study and from other people's study, the other bit of that we need to think about is the context within which people work. And we talk about getting the basics right, absolutely right, I have no problem with that. But I can guarantee you, every single day, there are thousands of practitioners getting the basics right superbly and heading off things getting worse, preventing serious harm, and doing it incredibly well and with great compassion and great skill. And of course, we can miss that when we focus on where it's gone horribly wrong. We're quite right when we focus on it, but we must be cautious that we don't jump in and criticise, in my view. Very often people are doing incredibly good work, but also, at the risk of sounding like a conservative politician, working in very difficult circumstances. So frequently services underfunded, frequently services being merged and redefined and reorganised, insufficient staff. We've got senior politicians and policymakers now saying, don't focus too much on staff numbers, that really doesn't matter. These are serious concerns, and we cannot ask people to be able to have those meaningful, engaged therapeutic conversations with people, really work and engage with people, and do really skillful work around the most difficult and sensitive stuff. There's, as you say, the talking about this really difficult, uncomfortable, embarrassing stuff sometimes. We cannot ask people to do that when they're working in an environment which does not support that. And the priorities for our services and our policymakers as well are not necessarily synchronous with the things that we're talking about. And that's a problem. It's not an excuse for people not to try and improve things, but it is a problem. If I could go on for 2 hours on this, I'll shut up now, and we can open up to some questions. Thank you.
Would anyone on the panel like to pick up on anything first, or should we open it up? Over to you.
Okay, so if there's anyone who has a question, if you'd like to raise your hand, and I will come to you. Yep, there's someone right at the back.
Hi. First of all, thank you all for sharing your experiences with us and your expertise. I have a question about what we talk about sometimes about the algorithms and the risk factors. And there's a point where some people mention the actuarial evidence of people who are at risk. I'm just wondering, as a clinician and trainee, I often find myself thinking, where is the actuarial data? Where are the calculations about what are the exact risk factors that we should be looking at? And why aren't they codified in some way? That's it.
So I think
sorry, Michael, that's an interesting question. The conference which I was just at, someone was talking about using machine learning to look at these very complex data sets and try to begin to do what you said, which is to actuarialize, that's a word, these data. So over to you.
Thank you. I wasn't thinking about machine learning, but I was thinking about forensic psychiatry, that I think has been leading on actuarial risk management. So I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, so there are various structured tools, and I outlined some strengths and weaknesses of them. I mean, a lot of them you have to buy, and you have to be trained to use them. So I mean that limits their usefulness maybe in more general settings. So they do exist in. I mean, I think people have reviewed the evidence for suicide risk assessment, and the tools there are a little bit less evidence around them. So, for instance, there's a series of Beck tools, and there's something called the SADS person scale, and these don't seem to do as well. So they, but in the absence of other tools, they are widely used. And there was a survey done, I think, where people looked at what tools were being used, and many services had developed their own and they were not validated. So, I mean, there's obviously a need out there. And, I mean, there's a risk if researchers that fill the gap, local services try and come up with their own systems which aren't actually maybe very, very evidence-based.
Yes, and I think that, are we partly thinking that way to make ourselves feel better? Because I think we're going around it the wrong way, because we've had decades of international research looking at exactly which factors will put someone at heightened risk of suicide, and if so, by how much and for how long. We haven't found anything. And it's not just me that says that, the international experts say that, and they say quite openly that we are very far from coming anywhere close, and it's people like Nock, Klonsky, Rory O'Connor. They say that quite openly. And it's almost like we're searching for this holy grail which doesn't exist, and we're missing what's right underneath our nose. And the key thing is that suicidality absolutely fluctuates all the time. We don't understand it enough. However, rather than wasting our time, focusing on the one risk factor, why don't we, as Bolton and colleagues suggested in the BMJ late last year, why don't we implement huge, large-scale population-type approaches? So, for example, if someone has a suicidal thought or self-harms, that they have a safety plan. But it's a safety plan which is designed by them. It's not something a practitioner does and gives to them. So we can do that for starters. So rather than being focused on naming the risk and characterising and quantifying it, you accept that yes, the risk is elevated. We're pretending that we know exactly the answer for how long and when. Actually, let's be pragmatic. Let's help this person so they no longer feel like this. I don't know if you want to. I heard you nodding then.
Well, I mean, I would particularly agree with your position in exploring an individual's relationships to suicide, suicidal thoughts and behaviours, and designing a safety plan around that.
No?
Well, bearing in mind what you said about risk assessment being a very imperfect science, Alice, one of the things which I found in practice was that risks seem to drive decisions, say, to admit people to hospital, that a lot of the perceived role among the public of psychiatrists and mental health is that it's a service for mental health covered in the newspaper. Very often it's a story about risk. And so this is a sort of disjuncture between the imperfect science and that immense amount of weight on these decisions, which is quite worrying, isn't it?
Yeah, don't get me wrong, it is important to undertake a thorough and diligent assessment, absolutely, and to ask and identify risks, and obviously then as practitioners, we have to know the latest evidence base. But be wary that some risk factors may increase your risks may double them, may triple them. But if they're on a low base rate, it's not hugely perhaps as important as the ability to engage someone and actually look at their protective factors, because we've talked a lot about risk factors, we haven't talked about protective factors, and about engaging with that person, particularly in terms of suicide and self-harm, so they no longer want to, because generally it's related to intolerable distress. generally. And if you can help someone find less harmful ways of working with their distress, then the drive to self-harm or end their life suddenly does not seem so palpable. So of course we have to know all the risk factors, but it should be part of an assessment process that looks at the person's needs, looks at their assets, and the NICE guidelines are really clear that risk tools should not be used to allocate or not allocate care. So although I'm, on one hand I'm saying that ignore just looking at risks, but clearly you have to identify them, but they should not be used to triage whether that person has care or not. Because I don't know any other branch of medicine which is so influenced that at the start of the assessment, the unconscious bias the practitioner has is huge if they know they have no beds, if they know that home treatment has no capacity. That's huge unconscious bias, and there's too much subjectivity about it.
Shall I go over here first? We'll pass the microphone along. Try and hold the microphone.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about who you sort of see as responsible, or maybe who you think should be involved in either training or providing some kind of material if what we need is compassionate care by professionals, by healthcare professionals. Whose kind of responsibility is it to almost train or encourage them to be compassionate, and how to do that? How do we ask the right questions? And if we are going for developing some kind of risk assessment tool, maybe, again, whose responsibility would that be, especially if we are developing something that might be free to be used and accessed?
Whose responsibility do you think it should be?
I'm not really sure, but I'm really
I'm going to talk about risk from others before it gets forgotten again. So, for example, there's good practice within the field of domestic violence and the people that being at risk of domestic violence. There's been some trials in primary care where there was mutual training between domestic violence support services or charities and health practitioners. So, and there's also been a similar pilot trial of that between domestic violence advocacy workers and mental health professionals, where people mutually train each other. So we get training from domestic violence advocates on issues specific to domestic violence, and it's specifically around those issues: how to ask, how to respond to disclosure, how to respond safely. And equally, they get training from us on, times when they referral pathways, or times when they should raise their concerns with others or escalate concerns. So I think that might be one way to go. It's probably, maybe perhaps both in terms of risk to others and risk from others. It can't also within the health sector, but across the relevant sectors.
Just wanted to come in and pick up on something that you said when it came to risk, and I think it's been touched on a few times, and I think I wonder if we're thinking about a one-size-fits-all tool, or if we need to be thinking more about personalised tools, and I wonder if we can perhaps pick up on that. And one of the concerning things for me, I'm not sure if anyone else would like to comment on it, when I started in psychiatry, that I went into it because I was interested in mental health and helping people who were experiencing distress, was that I found teams treating the risk instead of treating or trying to help the patient. And I know that in resource poor settings at the moment, that the patients are being discharged not because they're recovered or well, but because they're not risky enough for the service.
I'll just pick up on the whose responsibility and around sort of training. Certainly from a mental health nursing perspective, all of our students receive education and training, development in working with people in a way that's about active listening. It's about genuinely trying to establish a relationship, being respectful, sensitive, and encouraging people to tell their stories and hear from them what's going on for them. Similarly, We do practice sessions with role plays and scenarios where it's about working with carers and family members, getting information from them, working with them, supporting them. That's at our university, City University. I don't expect that's unusual. I suspect that's pretty familiar that most universities train mental health nurses. It also gets supplemented and built on in practice, in clinical placements, their practitioner colleagues. I'm not quite sure what similar training there is for psychiatrists. I don't know how that works. That would be quite interesting to hear. That's one element of it, of course, and then there's the specific focus on risk factors, and again, which would be a mainstay of any mental health nursing education training program.
I certainly think it should start at undergraduate level, and I think that the knowledge, skills and expertise and confidence that we would have at the different stages of our career would be different and would reflect the experience and seniority. But I would actually, one day the vision has to be that we take mental health and emotional well-being and resilience into schools. And we actually on a huge population level. And when I say resilience, I don't mean mental toughness. I mean emotional resilience and resourcefulness. And that involves emotional capacity, social support, self-care, self-compassion. So please don't get me started on mental toughness, because absolutely not. And you start young, and then obviously at either medical school or student social work or student nurses, that it's proportionate to their role. But the more senior we become and the more complex the decisions we may have to make and more difficult, then obviously we need specialist training in the same way that we have with basic life support and advanced life support. And you ask most practitioners how many lives they've saved from CPR, and it's really not many of us. You ask us how many people we've seen at the point of suicide that we believe that we've helped, and our patients believe that we've helped them, and I tell you it's far more.
Just going to continue from that, in my training, certainly as an undergraduate, as a medical student going through psychiatric training, I pretty much heard entirely from psychiatrists or sometimes psychologists, occasionally nurses. But this is going back a long way, but I don't know how much that's changed. I didn't hear from service users, mental health service users very much at all, and I'm sure it would have, I chose to do psychiatry and then I learned a huge amount once I arrived on the shop floor, but up to that point I could very much become a GP, a surgeon or whatever, obviously I had better ideas, without ever having met a person with mental health problems in a context where I could explore what that was like and how they experienced me talking with them or what have you. I would just be in there and being a doctor assessing these situations in A&E without ever having met an actual person with mental health problems. So that is a problem.
Yeah, I would agree that, when people are being educated, it should be an environment in which they can interact with service users, carers and even practitioners working in tough contexts, to learn what it will be like, and to have the conversations in the educational context where they're supported with their learning rather than being thrown into the practice context with all the risks that implies.
Okay, I'd sort of answer that question in a different way, pose a different question in a way, which is that I think training is very, very good, but it also depends on the system in which people work every day and the culture of that system. And some of that's dependent on resources and money and beds, but some of it isn't as well. So I think that the training is one thing to focus on, but we also need to think about the whole work environment and the professional culture. But any more questions? Yes.
This is a question about risk to self. I'm not sure if it's going off on a tangent slightly, but it's more to do with the risk that people with eating disorders pose themselves. From my experience, I found that when people conduct risk assessments for eating disorders, it's all to do with BMI and how much weight people have lost, but particularly with cases like bulimia, I don't feel like this is the most effective risk assessment. I was just wondering what training GPs get in regards to eating disorders and what you guys think would be a more effective risk assessment?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the truth is, actually, I don't have much training necessarily. But actually, I would say that most psychiatrists don't have that much training specifically about eating disorders. I mean, it may be that it's vastly changed in the last few weeks and months, but I suspect not. I don't think we have enough. And I think that sometimes when people talk about harm to self, they think specifically about self-harm as in overdoses or cutting maybe. And they don't think about the broader types of harm. And there are also some types of harm that we do to ourselves that are almost seems more acceptable. And sometimes professionals will do that, overworking, over-exercising. You know, there are lots of different things, but actually, ultimately, it may cause harm to us. So I think we do need to have more education. And I think if the practitioners had more education, they would understand that if you simply just focus on BMI, you're missing the distress, and you're missing the reason probably why people do engage in these behaviours. So, yes, you do need to have the building blocks to know what to ask about. But also, even if you don't really know, to even say to the patient, well, what's important to you? Is there something I haven't asked you that you really think I should have asked you? How many of us say that? I mean, maybe almost like the more senior you become, the more confident you are to say that, to show that perhaps you don't know everything. But I do think, yes, we need to broaden our knowledge both and the curriculum to make sure that everyone has it, not just those people who work in areas of perhaps expertise or special interest. Does anyone else want to add?
Not much. Yes. I think our kind of expression when you ask the question, something's a bit like it's about that. Not any massive great detail. I remember, it's just a small anecdote, someone telling me that if you leave London and you're a consultant, this is all consultant avoidance radio, if you go outside London, you're a consultant, you may not have a specialist eating disorder service to refer to, and that really scared me because I don't feel confident enough to manage and treat somebody with disorders. So that's something else I need to do during my training, but it's not really something that's I think there's enough time spent on learning about beyond the physical consequences.
I wonder if we have any questions from Twitter or from the web.
We have a few, and one of them relates to funding, and which ties into a similar question, which is what's the greater risk, a lack of resources or overburdensome risk assessments which get in the way of therapeutic relationships?
Well, I sort of think that there isn't necessarily a dichotomy here. I mean, first of all, there's what we can do to predict risk, and then what we can do to manage it, and they conceptually are different things. So, you can use the informational risk factors, particularly those that add something incrementally, to think about prognostically going forward, and then there are things you can do to mitigate that risk. That includes the therapeutic relationship, obviously it's key to all of that. So that's one issue. And the other thing is that the whole process of doing that well might actually also mitigate risks. And the whole process of actually asking someone and then dealing with that in a therapeutic way may be in itself quite an effective way of reducing risk. And there is a little bit of evidence around that actually. Hasn't been randomized. I just want to say something about resources as well, because if you look at, for instance, who gets a statin, who doesn't get a statin, that's partly done on a risk assessment of someone's cardiovascular risk going forward 10 years. It was 20%, now it's reduced to 10%. So if you go to your GP, they do a simple risk assessment. The same thing happens in many countries of the world using the Framingham score, and that's just one way alongside obviously discussing it with the patient, there's lots of individual, possibly idiosyncratic risk factors that have to be considered, but it's one way of anchoring that discussion in something evidence-based. And statins are an important intervention, but also, I mean, relatively, one has to think about resource implications of using large amounts of medication. So, I mean, this happens. I mean, people think about how to use resources efficiently and targeted in the best way, using a range of methods, and one of them can be using an actuarial probabilistic approach to risk. And the other thing I wanted to say was something also in relation to what our chair was saying, is that I do think there are different. These tools will have to be different for different settings and different outcomes. So there will not be something that works for violence and works for suicide, and there may not be something that works for, let's say, the prison population, but also works for a population of people in hospitals. So there will have to be different tools, and we now have the computing power and some of the new databases that are available that enable you to do that. And so the fact that it hasn't been done may just also be the fact that science does progress and progress relatively slowly. And now we have not only technology but also some of the new resources available to us that enables these better prognostic models to be developed. What people in medicine call clinical prediction models, and we call it risk assessment, but you can call it different things. And machine learning is one way that can be used, but there are other ways which I think our statisticians recommend, which might have more face validity. So the fact that it hasn't been great so far, I think, should just be an incentive to people in research and others working with researchers to actually look at this area and see what's possible.
I just can't resist adding something because we talk about statins, because I often compare people having suicidal thoughts to the way we respond to people perhaps who have risk factors for heart disease. Now, the number needed to treat for a statin to be effective is about 95. I think it's quite a large number needed to treat. And if we look at somebody questions their internal experience, because just saying suicidal thoughts, that's often when we finish our assessment. It should be where we start our assessment. And the other thing is that often in heart disease in the olden days, people didn't intervene literally until someone was having a heart attack. And I feel we're almost at that point now in terms of suicide prevention, that we're waiting literally to save people at the point where they might end their life. That if we could go far more upstream and build up people's own resilience and their own resourcefulness, so that some people may not even develop a thought of suicide because they've got the coping strategies and the emotional and social support to cope with the life adversity. Because suicidal thoughts are not just about mental illness, absolutely not. So people think that self-harm is about mental illness. It's not necessarily. Sometimes it might be, but not invariably. And I think there are so many more social and psychological things we could be doing. And actually, if we could convert spending time with the patient, obviously that has an economic cost, but we're quite happy to give a statin. So I think we need to think about spending time in a therapeutic relationship being as valid an intervention as any other intervention.
Thanks. So we have another question over here.
Before we go to that, I was just wondering, Niall, in terms of getting better risk assessment tools, and really we're asking how do we get a better crystal ball to look into the future?
Yes.
So as an editor of a journal, does that mean we need more quantitative and qualitative research?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, I take Alice's point that qualitative research is very important. I think one of the things in psychiatry is that it's easy to forget that it is a comparatively young specialty. We can compare ourselves to cardiology, but I think we're a young specialty compared to cardiology, and that on that basis, qualitative research is useful if only to figure out what quantitative questions we should be asking.
Great.
So yes, now there's a gentleman over here with a question, so I'm just going to pass the microphone along.
got dangerously close to stealing my question there, but I think it's still unique. Speaking as a researcher, it's relatively easy to develop risk assessment tools and to elicit evidence showing that they are useful in some way. Meanwhile, the kind of to evaluate the kind of therapeutic relationships and kind of large-scale service delivery interventions that I was just talking about, these are really, really difficult to evaluate and to generate evidence for. So if we kind of think about this as a dichotomy, the risk assessment tools are always going to win the evidence arms race. So I wondered if the panel had any views on, as researchers, for researchers, how we can go about better uniting the two and kind of building the evaluation of risk assessment tools alongside kind of, what might potentially be more important service delivery type interventions.
It's a really interesting question, and it sort of overlaps with what was going on in my head when that last discussion was happening. And I'm not going to quite answer your question, but I'm going to go in that area. And it was, and I was just thinking to myself, I've never been on the receiving end of a risk assessment. I've never been on the receiving end of these tools being used. I've used a couple of them, not extensively, and I just wonder what it feels like being on the end of being assessed in that way. And my gut feeling, and this is going to lead me to my research idea, my gut feeling is that if I was in deep distress to the point that thoughts of ending my life were around, and that I was not seeing the point of going on, that the thing that would, I think, engage me would be someone who I felt I could trust in front of me, someone who I felt was sincere and was genuinely interested in me, and I felt was going to try and understand and help in some way. If someone came along going through some process, even if they did it quite skillfully, and I think we can do that, which involved sort of answering a series of questions, I'm not sure that would work for me. Now that may be very personal to me. So my research idea is, and maybe this has been done, I don't know, I would love to see some research around people's experiences of being subject to assessment, and what it feels like, what it makes them think and feel, and whether they find that helpful, because I've got an inkling that it may not. I may be wrong.
I think it's a point well taken. I mean, the tools have to be linked to interventions. So I mean, it's, in a way, I mean, that's one of the themes I think everyone has brought up, is that it's not just good enough to do an assessment, it has to be more than that, and it has to be linked to something, and it might be just the nature of the assessment, but also, I mean, ideally it's linked to something else which is evidence-based in terms of mitigating risk. So you can think of, for instance, in people with schizophrenia, it may be that you bring forward when they start clozapine, or you add in an intervention for a comorbid disorder that you know increases risk, like substance abuse, or you think about some adherence type, improving adherence, either using a depot or some other type of adherence-based psychological therapy, for instance. So, I mean, there's a range of interventions. I mean, there has to be some thought about which is the one that is the candidate one that is going to work best in relation to the particular risk you're interested in. And then, I mean, then people have to evaluate them, and ideally evaluate them in using trial methods. And you can use smart designs using electronic records to sort of improve the costs and efficiency of those sort of types of research. You can use before and after studies. I mean, so there are some designs that maybe are suitable. And I mean, you say it's relatively easy to develop these tools. I take a little bit of issue with that. I can just say from my own personal experience, I managed to crash Oxford and Karolinska servers trying to do some of the imputations with our particular tools, because you have to, if you do it really well, you have to do imitations many, many times with large data. I managed to crash them both, and it needs a big service.
So I guess similarly, but maybe with some specific examples, I wonder if the way forward is to work back from interventions and ask, what evidence do I need in order to improve the interventions that I've tested that haven't worked? So, for example, there's some research that if people have been recent victims of violence, they're less likely to respond. Say someone with schizophrenia is less likely to respond to standard treatment. And then that was taken into account and used to develop trauma-focused CBT, and then the outcomes were better. Similarly, in my field in perinatal psychiatry, we know that if mothers have a severe mental illness in pregnancy and postnatally, there's a risk to the infant and risk of poor bonding, possibly poor development. And they found that if you treat the mental illness, if you treat the postnatal depression, that improves the mother's symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily improve the parent-infant relationship, and that's an observation. And that got fed back into developing specific parent-infant interventions, and that was needed alongside the standard interventions. So I think just looking at what interventions have worked, where the gaps are, what didn't work about the intervention in terms of mitigating risk, and do we have the observational evidence relevant to improve the intervention? If not, why are we developing a tower of feedback into a modification of the intervention?
I don't have an answer for your question. I'm getting that. But I was wondering, I guess when doing research of this work, well, I guess what's important is defining what it is we're saying we're doing. So having a way of defining therapeutic alignment, having a way of showing some kind of consistency. If we're testing that people are living up to that standard, that people are being appropriately compassionate or kind. I just wondered, partly also from my knowledge, do we have defined kind of ways of looking at that? So if we were to go into trials, that we could compare something with something else?
I think that's a really good question, because never has such a powerful concept as the therapeutic relationship seems to be been so ill-defined. We know so little about it. Constantly when you look at papers, people will say, what we're seeing there is a non-specific effect of the therapeutic relationship. But they might as well be saying it's someone using the force. Because the actual definition of what we mean, or even if we all mean the same thing when we talk about it, it's very nebulous.
Can I just say something?
Of course.
I'm a therapist.
Yes, I'll just give you the microphone.
Sorry, thank you. I'm a therapist, and the therapeutic relationship is obviously key kind of in kind of what we provide. And I think if you look at kind of therapeutic literature, then you'll see more clearer definitions of therapeutic. What the relationship is. We think about Rogers, the core conditions, empathy, unconditional positive regard, and there are other ones as well. So I think there is some literature and research in this, but it sounds as though everybody's kind of beginning to talk the same language, which I think is really important. I think as a therapist, we see the other side, and that's kind of what we work with, or that's what I work with and what I do.
I know that there are some tools in some of the specific psychotherapy modalities in their literature, but I wonder also, to come back, if then we would end up doing lots of therapeutic relationship assessments instead, which would potentially interfere with the therapeutic relationship, or would it enhance it, and then we need the evidence to show that. No.
We have a question over here, so I'm just going to pass the microphone along.
Firstly, thank you for doing this event. And with regard to the therapeutic relationship, it might be fruitful to try and think of it from the side of the service user. So they might tell you that they felt they had, trust in their therapist, etc. So that might be a useful thing for that. But I wanted to come back to this idea of compassion as an important resource in risk management, and it ties in with the resource question on Twitter as well. So doesn't quite exactly fit as an analogy, but if we think about public health interventions in the past in general medicine, like clean water, and the far greater impact that had on life expectancy compared with, say, antibiotics, and we think about the resource that exists in terms of compassionate people and in terms of lay people who have compassion, but they're not deploying that compassion because they're afraid of someone with schizophrenia or someone with severe depression. So they may want to be nice and help, but they're so afraid of how that person will behave. They think the person will behave bizarrely. Obviously, it ties into stigma. So the question is there any good research into positive protective effects of a sort of population level intervention where you try and educate society to better understand about the service users in their community, and whether it can be shown that that mitigates risk in some sense? And then from the resource side, maybe if there was such good evidence, you could use it to petition politicians and try and invest in this type of public health intervention. And as people become more aware, hopefully they will then become better advocates for mental health patients in general, and then we can get more resources for other things. So just that's what I was saying.
Thank you. I'll just mention one study from Australia, because I think Australia perhaps is further down the journey of having a public health approach. Particularly, this is about specifically suicide prevention. So there was one study by Jane Perkis and colleagues, and although I don't like the term suicide hotspot, and I could talk, spend lots of different words trying to explain it, because I know it's an upsetting term, so please forgive me. I don't mean anything bad by using it.
We had some correspondence on that subject, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, and I've spoken myself. I don't like the term, but for the conciseness, I'm using it until we get a better term. But they showed that 3 things reduce suicide, and one of them was third-party intervention, and it was because of public education that it gave that third party the confidence and the knowledge, because sometimes it's just confidence. They're compassionate enough already. And sometimes people are paralysed by fear of making things worse or not knowing what to say. And if we think about the case of Johnny Benjamin, who I'm sure most of us will know Johnny, he's a sort of a personal collaborator of mine, and he's a hero probably of most of us. Johnny was under the Mental Health Act on a psychiatric ward, and he tried to take his life. And it actually was a kind passerby that saved his life. It wasn't anybody from the team looking after him. So that's no criticism of the team. However, it's showing it was a kind passerby. And you just think, well, if Neil, people call him Mike, but he's actually called Neil. If Neil can do that, so I think that does come back to your point, and absolutely. And I think that we are taking that approach now in the UK far more, looking at this public health approach of the low-level intervention.
I'm not going to answer that question. I just want to come back on the earlier point, which was about the service user experience of assessment. Someone called Pauline Turnbull, I believe it's the doctor, has tweeted in and mentioned a small phenomenological study, 13 interviews with service users following assessment, following self-harm. It's quite interesting because it says that they were unsure of the purpose of the assessment. It had the potential to promote or challenge hope, depending on whether it was experienced as accepting or critical. And I think that's really important, that if people think we're being critical of their behaviours, then that certainly doesn't help. And then if follow-up care did not materialise, that reinforced their feelings of hopelessness and promoted disengagement from the services. And just a tiny, tiny study, but it's an interesting some pointers for areas where we might do more work.
So I'm going to go on your sort of side path there. I mean, I have been I think I'm assessed going to hospital for something. I can't really remember very much. What I do remember quite well is that I felt criticised for doing it. I felt criticised for being suicidal. So I did take that away with me, and I know that there would have been better ways to ask me questions, particularly what was kind of going on for me in my head and in my life, rather than what I was presenting with clinically. Just in terms of research going on about service user experience and perspectives and assessment, Dr. Angela Sweeney is currently undertaking a study on trauma-informed assessments in therapy, and she's part of the study is asking people who've been through the process their experiences in the context of their experience of trauma, and she's doing that at the moment. I think it's due to report in 2018, but she's doing that at St George's.
Just to kind of follow on from that, but also thinking about bringing people that aren't necessarily conventional professionals, together with service users, peer support was another area that was an increasing amount of research, and at UCL there was a large randomised controlled trial underway looking at how effective peer support is in people accessing crisis care. So it'll be interesting to see what that shows.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Another question? Good. Again, right at the back.
I'm a trainee and I'm on call this weekend, and I'm looking forward to putting some of the points of the panel into my practice. But I'm aware that I'm likely to come up against the idea that's already been mentioned before about framing the patients that I see, if I want to refer them to crisis teams for information and admission, in terms of their risk, and that is the thing that everyone focuses on, and that's the tool that we use to push the people to where we feel they're appropriate in the system. And I sort of made me think, what's driving this? And maybe if we can understand what's driving this, then we can work back and try and change it within the system. And I wondered, is it just a proxy for us having limited resources, and it's this way that the system has found is the easiest way to, make sure that we use those limited resources, and so maybe it's looking at it from that direction rather than the forward direction. Don't know what you think.
I mean, it may also be a proxy for modifiable risk factors, so there are things you can do something about. So, for instance, in particularly violence risk assessment, one of the ones that is almost common among many of the currently used tools is comorbid substance abuse. So it's difficult to treat, but at least it's, there are some. I mean, there may well be something you can do about that. So I agree. I mean, so sometimes it's a proxy about resources, but I think it's also a proxy about modifiable risk factors, and hence it's about ultimately trying to reduce the risk, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if the threshold for admission is too high in general wards and for home treatment teams. And I just say that from my clinical experience of working in perinatal psychiatry, where we can often argue for our patients, so perinatal looking after people who are pregnant up to 1 year postpartum, we can argue for our patients to be admitted at a lower threshold than they would be if they were not in the perinatal period. And so we have prophylactic admissions, and we have admissions for people who are quite distressed or needing treatment, it's quite proactive treatment, but who are not at acute risk. And they tend to have very positive experiences of their admission. And so in that sense, I wonder if it's a matter of resources.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions from the audience. I think we can probably get last remarks from the panel now. I think one of the things I've got from this is that dealing with this question, the many questions which we've raised, it's about talking to each other as professionals, and also with service users and carers. And hopefully we've managed to begin that process tonight. But I'd like to hear what the panel have to say.
Some final remarks.
I'd ask us to remind ourselves that the majority of risk factors that are population-based predict the suicide of a population across its whole lifetime. They're important to know about, but they don't necessarily help with that person sat in front of you. And you can have someone at a very high risk of suicide without some of the demographic risk factors. The other thing is we need to be focused from the start of the assessment. How can I help this person no longer want to end their life? How can I work with them to help stay safe? And it always should be focused on the ultimate, which is a safety plan, which may involve admission, it may not, but it's that everybody has a safety plan. If you're not sure how to make one, I know that there's a link on the Mental Health website to a resource called Staying Safe if you're not sure life is worth living. I would urge you to look at that. It's freely available, and it's being developed by academics, people with lived experience, practitioners, and the feedback so far has been very good, and thousands of people have seen it. And if you're a trainee, ask. And I don't think you can be too compassionate. And I just think if you're not sure, please do ask. Because seniors, we're basically there. If we pretend that we don't remember what it was like, we're fibbing. Because actually when we first started, we didn't know either.
I absolutely agree with the principle of talking to each other, particularly staff and service users and carers talking to each other, not only in the sort of clinical setting context, but outside that, particularly in devising research studies together that can be co-produced. And recognition that service users and carers have a wealth of knowledge that's often on the periphery of formal evidence at the moment. It can give sort of insight into some of the things that seem mysteries to people who haven't been through it, like what makes you want to kill yourself and why are you cutting up yourself. And there are things that have been written by service users and survivors. They're not in clinical journals. There's a particularly good piece of work written by a survivor quite a few years ago called Louise Pembroke, who first spoke out about her experiences of self-harm and gave very clear reasons and coherent reasons why she did so to manage unbearable distress and experiences. So I say look on what is currently on the periphery of formal evidence for insight into some things that seem mysterious about suicide and self-harm, and talk together with service users and carers and design studies
I concur. Some keywords I'm taking away from this, I like a lot. Complexity. Don't be scared of complexity. It's complex, but it can be thought about as a complex process. One size doesn't fit all, which is a very important message. There's going to be a magic solution to assessing risk for everybody, and you click a few, I don't know, you get an app, and then you know whether they need to be admitted or not. Particularly, I think we've talked about people who are able to talk, who maybe have the language and want to share their experiences. I work a lot with people with schizophrenia, sometimes with very negative symptoms, so I think that's a group we also have to think about, that not everybody might want to approach the assessment process in the same way, or talk about things in the same way. And I'll finish with classic, more research is needed.
But also, if I can just say as I'm passing it, as well as more research, let's not forget to put what we already know into practice. There is a huge decline between the research we know and what we do every day when no one's watching, and we can improve that today. Thank you.
I'm going to say one thing because Sarah nicked the name that I was going to say, which I wrote down on my pad just before you said it, which was Louise Pembroke. I was a newly qualified mental health nurse, and I remember going to a meeting which was about people's experiences of self-harm, and there was a woman there called Louise Pembroke who I'd never met or heard before, and she was upset and very, very angry about the experiences she and other people like her had, and it frightened me to death. It absolutely scared me. She was so angry, and I felt like I was the enemy because I was there as a newly qualified mental health nurse. But it was one of the first service users who got me to hear and think about their experience and what it was like to be on the receiving end of some pretty awful behaviours by so-called professional staff. And that sowed something in me, which is still here. So for me, the big message always is we have to develop the capacity and ability to really listen to people, engage with people, be respectful, sensitive. But that's not easy. It's not something we can easily do. It's not something we can easily do in the context within which we ask people to work. So my message is we need to also think about what do we do to support and enable people to do that on a daily basis, day in, day out, week in, week out, month after month, with people in severe distress. It's very, very emotionally demanding work, and yet we treat it like it's nothing, and that's wrong.
So I mean, I think as long as we're aware of its limitations, I mean, prognosis can be useful. It's useful in heart disease, cancer, insurance, weather. I mean, it's used in lots of domains of life, and as long as we're aware of its limitations, I think it can be useful. And just one other thing is that I think it's just be aware that people shouldn't really conflate prediction and management. I think but they should go together. And I think awareness of risk factors need to go together with good clinical examination. I mean, they're not separate. It's not just people should just look at checklists and forget about doing a clinical assessment, a proper full assessment. And equally, it's not just people doing the assessments and people receiving them. I mean, there must be some collaboration between the two, and so I think, you know, just awareness that there's lots of these areas are not either or. I mean, often we're talking about using these tools as part of the bigger picture.
Thank you. So I guess two things. The question for us, for the panel, was, you know, preventing harm. Is it evidence-based? What else can we do? And just two thoughts on that. We talk about harm in three areas: harm to self, harm to others, harm from others. And actually, there's quite a lot of overlap, both in terms of general themes and also clinically. Often there's overlap in these presentations. And the second thing is, I think it's striking how much of the evidence is there for identifying people at risk, predicting risk, and how little of the evidence is managing the risks. So I do think we need to move the research agenda onto intervention.
Thank you very much indeed. So lastly, it remains for me to thank once again our panellists, thank everyone in the audience for coming, both here and on Twitter and over the internet, and Professor Sonia Johnson here at University College London, the mental health and the Lancet Psychiatry. One of the things that that I learnt in terms of risk assessment, and whether it's true or not, that the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. So judging by this evening, I hope you will agree that it was a very stimulating discussion, and that hopefully future events will be just as interesting. So thank you very much indeed.